The moment Eudora Brooks walked through the double doors of Caldwell's General Hall and saw every single seat at the autumn social already occupied, her stomach dropped straight through the floorboards. Every chair along the long communal tables, every bench pulled close to the lantern-lit walls, every stool dragged in from Miller's Hardware next door, all of them filled with the bodies of Dusty Creek's finest citizens, laughing and talking, and helping themselves to the cornbread and apple cider that Martha Yates had spent 3 days preparing. Every seat but one. One chair sat alone at the far end of the center table, conspicuously empty, conspicuously positioned, and conspicuously guarded by the broad-shouldered, sun-bronzed, and entirely too composed figure of Albert Garrison, who sat beside it with his hat resting on the table's edge and his dark eyes fixed directly on the door, as though he had been watching for exactly her arrival. He had been saving it. The realization hit her like a cold wind off the plains in November. He had been saving it for her. Eudora did not move for 3 full seconds. She stood in the doorway with the October night pressing against her back and the warm glow of a dozen oil lamps throwing gold across her green dress, and she looked at Albert Garrison across that crowded, noisy room, and she felt something crack open inside her chest that she had been keeping firmly sealed for the better part of 6 months. Because Albert Garrison was not supposed to want anything to do with her. He had made that perfectly clear on the afternoon of April the 12th, when he had stood on the steps of the Dusty Creek Land Office and signed over the eastern quarter section of the Garrison Ranch to the bank without so much as glancing at her, despite the fact that her own father's debt had been the hidden reason the bank had come calling in the first place. She had watched from across the street with her heart in her throat, and he had never looked up. She had built the entire architecture of the last 6 months on that single piece of evidence, that Albert Garrison was a man who could make painful sacrifices in silence and never once ask for credit, never once look to the person the sacrifice was made for, never once suggest that any of it was personal. And now he was sitting at the autumn social with an empty chair beside him and his eyes on her like she was the only lit window in 100 miles of dark prairie, and everything she thought she understood about him and herself, and the strange, charged silence that had lived between them since the moment they had first met was threatening to come completely undone. She made herself breathe. She made herself walk forward, and that was when the trouble truly started. It had begun, as most things in Dusty Creek began, with the land. The year was 1883, and the Kansas cattle town of Dusty Creek sat at the crease between the open range and the spreading tide of homestead farms like a man trying to keep his boots dry in a flooding river. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway had pushed a spur line through the valley 3 years prior, and the resulting economic jolt had turned a collection of dugouts and a trading post into a genuine town with a main street, a telegraph office, a schoolhouse, a Baptist church, and the ambitions to go with all of them. The cattle drive still came through in the season, raising enormous clouds of red dust and filling the single saloon with trail-weary cowboys who spent their wages in 48 hours and moved on. But the homesteaders were arriving now in steady numbers, filing claims on quarter sections, breaking sod, stringing wire, and staking a future on rain that was not always reliable and soil that was harder than the advertisements back east had suggested. Into this particular collision of worlds, Eudora Brooks had arrived on a Wednesday morning in late February of 1883, stepping off the Santa Fe with 2 trunks, a carpet bag, a box of books, and a letter from the Kansas Board of Education certifying her as a qualified schoolteacher. She was 26 years old, which was considered by some of Dusty Creek's more opinionated residents to be somewhat advanced in age for an unmarried woman arriving alone, though Eudora had no patience whatsoever for that particular line of thinking. She had taken the schoolteacher position because she had needed it, and she had needed it because her father, Clement Brooks, had died in the autumn of 1882, and left behind not the modest security she had expected, but instead a collection of debts that read like a novel of bad decisions, made in good faith over the course of a decade. Clement Brooks had been a kind man, a devoted father, and a catastrophically optimistic investor in ventures that had failed with remarkable consistency. He had borrowed against his small Illinois farm more than once, and the last loan had come from the First Territorial Bank of Kansas, which had branches stretching across the new state like roots looking for water. Eudora had discovered the full scope of the debt only after she had settled Clement's affairs in Illinois, and found herself facing a number that her salary as a schoolteacher in Milburn could not touch in any reasonable time frame. The Kansas Board of Education had offered her a position in Dusty Creek that paid considerably more than anything available in Illinois, and she had taken it without allowing herself to think too hard about what it meant to leave everything familiar behind. She had not known, when she accepted the position, that the First Territorial Bank's Dusty Creek branch manager, a man named Horace Finch, also held the note on her father's debt. She had not known that Horace Finch was the kind of man who used financial leverage as casually as other men used conversation. And she had absolutely not known that Albert Garrison, whose cattle operation ran 15,000 head across the best grassland in the valley, and whose family name was the oldest and most established in the county, had his own complicated relationship with Horace Finch and the First Territorial Bank. She learned all of this in layers, the way you learn most things that matter slowly, incompletely, and always slightly too late to avoid being already involved. She had met Albert for the first time in March, 3 weeks after her arrival, at the church potluck that Reverend McAllister organized every month as an excuse to force his congregation into something resembling community. Albert had arrived late, straight from the range by the look of his dusty coat, and had taken the last open seat at the table where Eudora happened to be sitting with the Yates family and old Dr. Sheridan. He had introduced himself with a directness she found refreshing after 3 weeks of people talking around subjects rather than at them, had asked her 4 specific questions about what she intended to teach, and whether she found the schoolhouse building adequate for winter use, had listened to her answers with the focused attention of a man who actually wanted to hear them, and had then been called away by his ranch foreman before the meal was even finished. He had left an impression the size of a barn door. She had told herself it was merely the novelty of meeting someone in Dusty Creek who communicated in complete sentences and did not stare at her as though her presence alone was an unsolvable mystery. She had told herself that the particular sensation of being genuinely listened to after months of navigating her father's death and her own financial fear was simply relief, not anything more complicated than that. She had been lying to herself, and she had known it even at the time. Over the weeks that followed, she encountered Albert with the frequency that a small town produces naturally, and each encounter left the same impression of someone solid and contained, and quietly watching the world with more intelligence and feeling than he ever put on display. He helped her move the heavy readers from the church storage to the schoolhouse when he happened to be passing with a wagon. He left a cord of cut firewood stacked against the schoolhouse wall in early April without mentioning it to anyone, and she only knew it was him because young Tommy Yates had watched him do it at dawn and told her as if reporting a remarkable natural event. He tipped his hat to her on the street, which any man in Dusty Creek would do, but his eyes lingered in a way that was not quite tipping hat behavior, and she had to make herself look away each time because she was fairly certain her own eyes were doing the same thing. Then came April the 12th, and everything she had been quietly, carefully building in the private architecture of her own hope came apart in a way she could not fully explain to herself. It started when Horace Finch arrived at the schoolhouse on a Thursday afternoon, during the 15 minutes between when the children left and when Eudora began her grading. He was a small man with excellent clothes and a manner so smooth it made her want to check her pockets when he left. He sat down across from her at the teacher's desk without being invited and explained, with the pleasant expression of a man delivering good news, that her father's debt to the First Territorial Bank had just been retired. Eudora had stared at him. Retired was not a word you used about a debt like her father's. You used paid when someone paid it. You used forgiven when a bank decided the cost of collecting was not worth the effort. Horace Finch had used retired, which was neither of those things. Retired how? She had asked. Finch had smiled. Mr. Albert Garrison purchased the note this morning and settled the obligation in full. As of today, Miss Brooks, your father's debt no longer exists. She had felt the words land but had been unable, for a full 30 seconds, to make sense of them. Albert Garrison had paid her father's debt. A debt she had not discussed with him. A debt she had not even fully disclosed to anyone in Dusty Creek, because the humiliation of it was a private weight she carried inside her chest. He had somehow known about it. Finch, she realized with a cold certainty, had been the source of that information, which meant Finch had used the debt as a lever of some kind, and he had paid it. The amount was enough that he had needed to sign over the eastern quarter section of the Garrison ranch to the bank to cover it. He had given up land for her, land his family had held for 20 years, and he had never said a single word to her about it. She had walked to the land office that afternoon not entirely sure what she intended to say or do, and she had arrived in time to see Albert coming out through the door with the signed papers in his hand, and she had seen the exact moment he registered her presence. A brief, total stillness, like a man who had been caught in something he had intended to keep private. And then he had looked down at the papers in his hand, and he had walked past her with nothing more than a polite, distant, Miss Brooks, and had gone to his horse and ridden away without another word. She had stood on the steps of the land office for a long time after he left. She had told herself that what she felt was anger, because anger was manageable. He had no right to involve himself in her personal affairs without her knowledge or consent. He had no right to sacrifice his family's land for a woman he had shared a handful of conversations with, and a quantity of charged silences. He had made her into someone who owed a debt she had never agreed to, and he had done it without giving her any say in the matter, and she was furious about it. She had also told herself, in the quieter moments just before sleep, that what she actually felt was something much closer to a terror she could not afford. Because a man who would do something that large, that quietly, that completely without expectation of acknowledgement, was the kind of man who could dismantle every careful defense she had built around herself since her father died and left her alone to figure out how to survive. She had avoided him for 6 months. She had kept her distance at church and at the general store and at every community event that Dusty Creek's social calendar offered up. She had been polite because she was always polite. She had been distant because she needed to be. And then October had come with its cooler air and its red-gold cottonwoods along the creek bottom, and Martha Yates had organized the autumn social at Caldwell's General Hall, and every seat had been taken except one, and Albert Garrison had been sitting beside it with his dark eyes fixed on the door, and Eudora Brooks had walked through that door and seen everything she had been avoiding standing right in front of her with a chair pulled out and waiting. She crossed the room with her chin up, and her hands clasped in front of her to keep them still. The crowd was noisy enough that nobody paid particular attention to her movement across the floor, though she was keenly aware that several pairs of eyes tracked her path with the avid interest that small towns always took in the navigation between single people at social events. Albert stood when she reached the table. He was tall enough that standing made him genuinely imposing, though there was nothing aggressive in his manner, just that quality of contained, deliberate attention that she had been trying to protect herself from for 6 months. He wore a clean white shirt and a dark vest and had left the range dust outside where it belonged. He looked exactly like himself, which was the problem. "Miss Brooks," he said, just those 2 words with his voice coming out of his chest at that low, careful register, and she felt the whole elaborate structure of her composed distance begin to vibrate like a wire in the wind. "Mr. Garrison," she said, "I see you've been conserving chair real estate." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but was clearly its precursor. Seemed like a reasonable precaution. She looked at the chair. She looked at him. She said, "You could have just asked me." "I thought about it," he said. "Thought about it quite a lot, actually. And I reckon this was easier," he said. "Asking requires an answer in the moment. This way you could walk out the door if you wanted to, and we'd both keep our dignity." Eudora sat down in the chair because she had not come this far across Kansas to run from a difficult conversation. She heard him exhale just slightly, just enough, as he settled back into his own seat, and she thought that for a man who had just won a small strategic victory, he looked remarkably like someone who understood the battle was only beginning. "Albert," she said quietly in the undernoise of the room around them, and she watched him go still at the use of his first name, which she had never used before. "We need to talk about April the 12th. "I know it," he said. "You paid a debt that was mine to carry," she said. "I did," he said, and did not look away. "Without asking me, without telling me, without giving me any choice in the matter." "That's accurate," he said, "and I won't pretend otherwise." Eudora folded her hands on the table and looked at them for a moment, gathering herself. "Why?" she asked. It was the question that had lived inside her chest for 6 months, the question she had been afraid to ask because she was afraid of the answer and equally afraid of there not being one. "Why would you do something like that?" Albert was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man avoiding the question, but the quiet of a man making sure he said the true thing rather than the easy thing. Around them, Dusty Creek citizens talked and laughed and passed plates of food, entirely unaware that something significant was happening at the end of the center table. "Because Finch was using it against you," he said finally. "He came to me in March and laid out your father's debt like it was a card in a game he was playing. Told me he intended to approach you about certain accommodations he felt you might make in exchange for his patience with the note. Made it clear he felt a woman alone, in a new town, with that kind of financial burden, might be persuaded toward arrangements that were not in her interest." Eudora felt the blood in her face go cold and then hot. "What kind of arrangements?" Albert's jaw was very tight. "The kind that decent men don't allow to happen to decent women when they have the means to prevent it." She stared at him. The full picture assembled itself in her mind with horrible clarity. Horace Finch, with his smooth manner and his excellent clothes, calculating that her isolated position and her father's debt made her vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with money. And Albert Garrison, who had known about it, who had taken it personally in a way that had cost him land and said nothing, because saying something would have required her to know about the threat in the first place, and knowing about it would have been its own particular humiliation. "You protected me," she said, "from something you never told me I needed protecting from." "I did," he said. "I've gone back and forth on whether that was right, whether you deserved to know, whether keeping it from you was its own kind of disrespect." He looked at her steadily. "I decided the shame of it wasn't yours to carry. The debt was your father's, the threat was Finch's. I wasn't willing to give you one more thing to carry." Eudora felt her carefully maintained composure doing something highly inconvenient in the region of her sternum. She made herself breathe. She made herself think. "And the land," she said. "Grass grows back," he said. "Quarter sections don't define a man." "Albert," she said again, and heard her own voice do something complicated with his name. You cannot purchase a person's safety and their debt and their peace of mind and expect them to accept it without discussion." "I don't expect anything from you," he said, with a quiet firmness that she recognized as the absolute truth. "I want to be clear on that. I didn't do it as a transaction. I didn't do it to put you in my debt. I did it because—" He stopped. The careful, contained man who always chose his words took a breath that was less steady than his usual ones. "I did it because by April the 12th, the idea of something happening to you that I could have prevented was not something I was capable of tolerating. That's the plain truth of it, Miss Brooks." The room seemed very loud around them and very far away at the same time. "You've been avoiding me since April," he said. "I have," she admitted. "Can I ask why?" Eudora looked at him for a long moment, at the face that had been occupying too much of her private mental landscape for the better part of a year, at the steady dark eyes that gave so little away and simultaneously telegraphed everything, at the man who had given up an acre of his family's land without asking for so much as a thank you. "Because," she said slowly, "I was afraid that if I talked to you about it, I would have to admit that what I felt when I found out was not anger." "What did you feel?" he asked very quietly. "I felt like someone had set down a weight I had been carrying so long that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight," she said. "And I did not know what to do with that, coming from a man I had known for 6 weeks. Albert Garrison looked at her as though she had just said the most significant thing he had heard in his life, and he was taking great care to ensure he understood every word of it correctly. "I've been sitting beside that empty chair since 7 o'clock, he said, which was not a response to what she had said, and was at the same time the most direct response possible. Eudora felt the last of the distance she had been maintaining crumble like dried clay in a rain. "How did you know I would come?" she asked. "I didn't," he said honestly, "but I reckoned if you showed up and saw it, you'd either sit down or leave, and either way we'd know where things stood. I was tired of not knowing." "So was I," she said before she could think better of it. Something settled in his expression then, a quiet, profound shift, like a landscape after weather has passed through. He didn't reach across the table. He didn't press the moment beyond what it was ready to hold. He simply said, "I'm glad you sat down, Eudora." And the sound of her first name in his voice was so careful and so certain at the same time that she had to look away at the crowded room for a moment just to collect herself. Martha Yates appeared at that point with a plate of cornbread and the expression of a woman who had orchestrated this particular seating arrangement from a safe distance and was deeply satisfied with the results, though she would deny it entirely if asked. She set the food down, said something bright and social about the good turnout, and moved away before either of them was required to respond. Eudora looked back at Albert. "I want to understand something," she said. "What happened to him?" A shadow moved through Albert's expression. "He resigned from the bank in June and moved to Wichita. I'm told the board of the First Territorial did not appreciate certain of his business practices coming to light." "You reported him," she said. "I reported what I knew," he said carefully. "I wasn't the only one with grievances on record. There were others, homesteaders mostly, who he'd applied similar pressures to. The bank took it seriously enough." Eudora absorbed this. The complete story was assembling itself in all its complexity, and she found herself looking at the man beside her with an accumulation of understanding that reordered everything she thought she had known. He had not simply paid a debt. He had dismantled a predatory system quietly and methodically, and protected not only her, but others who were vulnerable to the same manipulation. And he had done all of it without ever making himself the hero of the story in any visible way. "You are a remarkably complicated person for someone who presents as uncomplicated," she said. He almost smiled. "My mother would agree with that. She's still living." Eudora asked, grateful for the slight shift toward easier ground. "She is. She's in Abilene with my sister. Comes to visit 3 or 4 times a year and spends most of the visit telling me the house needs a woman's touch, which I interpret as her way of telling me I need to stop spending all my time with cattle." "She sounds wise," Eudora said. "She is exactly that," he agreed. "She told me in September that if I didn't speak to you directly before the autumn social, she would take the matter into her own hands. I elected to preempt her." Eudora laughed, and the laugh came out warm and genuine, and surprised her with how good it felt after 6 months of carefully maintained tension. Albert looked at her when she laughed with an expression that was entirely undefended, and she caught it before he could put his composure back in place, and what she saw in it made her breath stop for a moment. It was not desire, or not only that. It was something more specific and more dangerous, the look of a man who recognized in another person the particular quality of being entirely real, and found it something close to extraordinary. They ate the cornbread. They talked, carefully at first and then less so, about the school and the cattle operation, and the winter that was coming, and the way the valley had looked in August when the grass was at its height, and the sky was the specific blue that only existed in Kansas at that latitude. They talked about Illinois, which he had passed through once on a buying trip to Missouri, and thought was beautiful in its way but too flat and too wet for his preferences. They talked about books, and she discovered that he read more widely than she would have expected and had opinions about what he read that were direct and well-reasoned and occasionally surprising. They talked about the town and the future of it, and whether the homesteaders and the cattlemen were ever going to find a way to coexist that didn't involve someone losing ground, and she discovered that on this subject he was more nuanced and less defensive than any other large operation cattleman she had encountered, which admittedly was a limited sample. Around 9 o'clock, the social shifted toward dancing. Old Samuel Webb produced his fiddle, and Ira Caldwell pushed the center tables to the walls, and the floor cleared and couples began to find each other. Eudora had been a reasonably accomplished dancer before her father's death had taken most of the occasion for it out of her life, and she felt the music in her feet with the instinctive pleasure of someone reconnecting with a forgotten skill. Albert stood up and offered her his hand with the same directness he brought to everything, and she took it without overthinking it, because she had been overthinking things for 6 months, and she was genuinely tired of it. He was a better dancer than she expected, which she told him, and he said he had learned from his sister, who had been ruthless about it. They moved through the set with the ease of people who fit physically in a way that has less to do with practice and more to do with some innate spatial compatibility. She came to approximately his shoulder, and his hand at her back was certain without being possessive, and they navigated the crowded floor without collision and without the stiffness that often passed for propriety. During the second set, when the music slowed into something more deliberate, they came closer together by the natural logic of the dance, and she was suddenly and entirely aware of the warmth of him and the steadiness of his presence, and the way she had apparently, at some point during the evening, stopped feeling like she was standing on uncertain ground and started feeling like she was standing on bedrock. "I want to ask you something," he said, quietly enough that it was between them rather than the room. "Then ask," she said. "Would you allow me to call on you, properly, formally, if that's how you'd prefer it?" She considered this for exactly 3 steps of the dance. "I would not prefer formally," she said. "Formally means sitting in the parlor at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house with the door open and Mrs. Henderson within earshot, which is not how I want to have conversations with you." "Then not formally," he said. "However you want it." "I want to walk," she said. "I want to walk and talk the way we've been doing tonight, and I want to be able to say what I actually think without worrying whether it's appropriate to the occasion." "That suits me down to the ground," he said. "Sunday afternoon." "Sunday afternoon," she agreed. Outside, the October wind had sharpened, and the stars above Dusty Creek were thick and cold, and very bright in the way that stars are bright on the high plains when there is no cloud to diffuse them. Inside, the fiddle played on, and the social continued, and Eudora Brooks danced with Albert Garrison and felt the careful walls she had built over the past 6 months dissolve with the same quiet inevitability with which snow melts in April. Not all at once, but completely, and without the possibility of being reconstructed. Sunday arrived with the particular quality of autumn Sundays on the Kansas plains, all clean, sharp air and golden light, and the sound of dry cottonwood leaves scraping along the frozen ground. Albert came to Mrs. Henderson's boarding house at 2 in the afternoon with his good coat on, and his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who was almost but not quite nervous. And Eudora came down from her room in her good wool coat, and felt something flutter in her chest at the sight of him, standing in the boarding house parlor being politely endured by Mrs. Henderson, who was a determined romantic despite her manner. They walked north along the creek bottom, where the cottonwoods made a corridor of gold and amber above the path, and they talked the way she had asked for, directly, honestly, without the careful management of impression that most early courtship conversations required. He told her about the ranch, about the particular vision he had for what it could become, about his father who had come out of Missouri with 50 head and a lease on grassland that had taken 20 years to become ownership. She told him about Illinois and her father and the complicated grief of losing someone you loved, while simultaneously discovering they had not been entirely what you thought they were. She did not minimize Clement Brooks or make him worse than he was. She simply described him whole, with his warmth and his optimism and his catastrophic financial instincts, and Albert listened without judgment. "You loved him without conditions," Albert said. "I tried to," she said, "though there was a period after finding out about the debt when I was considerably less generous. I worked my way back to generous." "That's not a small thing," he said, "working your way back." "He was my father," she said simply. Albert was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that surprised her. "I envied that a little, the working back. My relationship with my father was simpler in some ways but harder in others. He was not a man who made room for ambivalence. You were with him or you weren't, and the ranch was the whole of what he thought worth being with. I was with him. I am with the ranch, I won't pretend otherwise. But sometimes I think there were other things I should have put up more of a fight for." "Such as?" she asked. He looked at the creek, at the thin ice beginning to form at the edges, and then at her. "Time," he said. "Presence. Choosing to be somewhere other than the work." He paused. "I'm 31 years old, and I've been so deep in the work since I was 17 that I sometimes think I looked up one day and 5 years had passed, and I couldn't account for a single evening of genuine rest in all of them." "What made you look up?" she asked. He smiled then, slow and entirely undefended. "There was a new schoolteacher," he said, "who sat across from me at the March potluck and talked about the insufficiency of the schoolhouse stovepipe with the kind of focused practical intelligence that I usually only associate with range management, and I found myself thinking about it for 3 days afterward." Eudora felt warmth move through her that had nothing to do with the wool coat. "The stovepipe," she said. "It's a serious infrastructure concern," he said gravely. She laughed, and he laughed with her, and the sound of it went up through the cottonwood branches and into the cold, bright Kansas sky, and it was, she thought, one of the finest sounds she had ever heard. They walked until the sun was well down toward the western hills, and then he walked her back to the boarding house and said goodbye at the door with the correct amount of propriety for a man calling on a woman for the first time, which in this case meant he held her hand in both of his for a moment longer than a handshake required, and looked at her in a way that communicated everything he was too careful to say too soon. She went inside and stood in the hall for a moment with her back against the closed door, and Mrs. Henderson, passing with a tea tray, said nothing at all but looked at Eudora's face and smiled the smile of a woman who recognized that particular expression. The weeks that followed had the quality of something precious being constructed from solid material. Albert called twice more in October, and each time they walked and talked and built the architecture of genuine mutual knowledge rather than mere attraction. She met his ranch foreman, a weathered man named Caleb Reeves who had been with the Garrison family for 18 years and regarded Eudora with the careful assessment of someone who took his loyalty seriously and extended it slowly. She sat with Albert on the porch of the ranch house one late October afternoon and watched him talk through a grazing decision with Caleb, and was struck again by the quality of his attention. The way he listened before speaking, the way he weighed what he heard before responding, the way he treated Caleb's experience as something worth knowing rather than something to overrule. She had students who were the children of homesteaders who had grievances with the cattlemen, and students who were the children of cattlemen's hands, and she watched the way those grievances played out in the schoolyard with the depressing accuracy of inherited conflict. She mentioned this to Albert one November afternoon, and he was quiet for a while before saying that it was one of the things that kept him awake. that the open range was closing, that the wire was going up, that the relationship between the large operations and the small homesteads was going to define what kind of place the valley became, and that he had ideas about how to navigate it that most of the other big operators found soft. "What kind of ideas?" she asked. "Cooperative water rights," he said. "Shared access to the creek during drought periods. Organized roundup schedules that account for homestead boundaries rather than running over them. Nothing that costs me more than a bit of goodwill and some organizational effort." He paused. "Most of the conflict out here isn't inevitable. It's the product of men deciding that what's theirs is worth more defended than shared." Eudora looked at him with the sense of falling into a realization she had been circling for months. "You're not like most men out here," she said. "I'm exactly like most men out here in most respects," he said carefully. "I want the land to prosper. I want the cattle to prosper. I want my family name to mean something in this valley 100 years from now. The difference might just be that I think those things are more likely if everyone in the valley is not at each other's throats." "Enlightened self-interest," she said. "If you want to call it that," he said. "I just call it paying attention to what actually works." November deepened into its colder self, and the first real snow came in the second week of the month and blanketed the valley in white, and turned the mountains to the west into something that looked like an illustration from a Bible story. The schoolchildren arrived each morning wrapped in layers and left tracks across the pristine schoolyard, and Eudora kept the stovepipe situation under fierce management and was gratified to report to Albert, when he asked, that not a single student had suffered for the cold. He arrived at the schoolhouse one Friday afternoon, with a surprise that he delivered with the particular sheepish manner of a confident man doing something that made him feel uncertain. 2 volumes from his personal library that he had noticed her mention wanting to read, procured through a book order to Abilene at what she estimated was considerably more trouble and expense than he would ever admit to. She took them and looked at the titles and looked at him and said, "Albert Garrison, you have a romantic soul hiding behind all that practical exterior." And he said, "I would appreciate it if you didn't advertise that broadly." And she said, "Your secret is entirely safe with me." And the way they looked at each other in that moment was not like 2 people at the beginning of something, but like 2 people recognizing something that had already been there for a long time. He kissed her for the first time on a Sunday in early December, on the creek path in the brief gold hour before sunset, in the middle of a sentence about winter feeding strategy that she had absolutely no memory of afterward. It was deliberate and certain, and exactly like him, not impulsive, not tentative, but fully committed to the moment in the way he was fully committed to every decision he made. She kissed him back with the equal certainty of someone who had spent months arriving at an answer, and was entirely ready to commit to it. He pulled back and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the last of December's pale sun caught the line of his face and the steadiness of his eyes, and she thought that, whatever it cost to have come to Kansas alone with 2 trunks and a carpetbag and a debt she hadn't known how to carry, the exchange rate had turned out to be more favorable than she had any right to expect. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear the whole of it before you respond." "All right," she said, and felt the return of a slight wariness, because a preamble like that in her experience rarely preceded something uncomplicated. "I love you," he said. "I've known it since somewhere around April and kept it to myself because the situation wasn't one where saying it was fair. But we're standing here now, and the situation is different, and I'm not interested in keeping it to myself any longer." Eudora held his gaze and felt the word love settle into her chest like something finding the exact right place for itself after a long search. "I love you too," she said. "And I want to be clear that I am saying it as a fact I have established, not as a response to your saying it first." He smiled at her then with his whole face, which was so rare and so complete that it made her heart do something entirely undignified. "I know the difference," he said. "I'm becoming something of a student of how you say things." "And I of you," she said. "You and your stovepipe concerns." He laughed, and she laughed, and the December cold and the fading light and the bare cottonwoods and the distant cattle and the impractical, urgent, entirely real fact of the two of them standing in the middle of the Kansas winter with their hearts laid completely open. All of it composed itself into a moment that Eudora would return to for the rest of her life, when she needed to remember what it felt like to be exactly where she was supposed to be. Christmas in Dusty Creek was a community affair with a church service in the morning and a gathering at the Caldwell Hall in the evening, a pattern the town had established in its early years and maintained with the tenacity of traditions that become load-bearing walls. Albert's mother, Margaret Garrison, came down from Abilene for the holiday, and Eudora met her on Christmas Eve at the ranch house over the dinner that Albert had prepared with more culinary ambition than technical skill, and that Caleb Reeves quietly intervened to rescue when Albert's back was turned. Margaret Garrison was a small, sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s who had come to Kansas from Missouri as a young wife, and had watched the territory become a state, and the open range fill in, and her husband build something from nothing and then die before the something was fully built. And she had carried all of that and more with the kind of compact, undemonstrative strength that Eudora recognized and respected deeply. She looked at Eudora for about 45 seconds before deciding something, and then she treated her for the rest of the evening as though the decision had been made permanently, and there was no more uncertainty to manage. "He's been impossible since April," Margaret told her at one point, while Albert was in the kitchen rescuing what he could of the gravy. "Quiet men are bad enough when they're content, but a quiet man with something on his mind is like a closed barn in a storm, all that pressure building up with nowhere to go." "I was not entirely easy either," Eudora admitted. "I know it," Margaret said. "He told me enough that I understood the situation. You had every right to your reservations." She paused. "But he's a good man, the best one I know, and I say that with full knowledge that I'm his mother and therefore biased. He's the kind of man who does the right thing quietly, which means he doesn't get credit for most of it, and he doesn't look for credit, and that's either a virtue or a character flaw depending on the circumstances." "In his case," Eudora said carefully, "I believe it's a virtue." Margaret smiled. "Then you understand him already. That's more than most people manage." The new year arrived with ice on the creek, and a temperature that made the cattle miserable, and kept the schoolchildren so bundled in their seats that Eudora sometimes despaired of teaching anyone anything through that many layers of wool. Albert managed the winter grazing with the focused competence she was coming to understand as his deepest native language, moving cattle to the southern pastures before the worst of the cold hit, setting up supplemental feed stations, bringing the most vulnerable of the herd into the sheltered draws where the wind could not find them. She went out to the ranch on 2 Sundays in January and watched him work and brought food and sat in the warm kitchen with Caleb's wife, Ada, who had come to live at the ranch after their marriage the previous spring, and talked about books and teaching, and the question of what this valley would look like in 20 years. Caleb and Ada Reeves were among the first people in Dusty Creek who welcomed Eudora into their trust fully, not because they were required to by social convention, but because they had watched her and Albert together and made an assessment. Caleb was not a demonstrative man, but on a February afternoon when Eudora was helping Ada put up the winter stores in the larder and Albert and Caleb were in the barn with a difficult foaling, Caleb passed through the kitchen and paused and said, "You're good for him, Miss Brooks. He needed someone who could keep up." It was the longest personal statement she had ever heard Caleb make, and it landed with the weight of a significant endorsement. In February, 3 things happened that reshaped the spring. The first was that the board of the First Territorial Bank, following the completion of its investigation into Horace Finch's conduct, made contact with Albert to offer a return of the Eastern Quarter section as acknowledgement of Finch's having used fraudulent means to extract the land transfer. Albert declined the return on behalf of the bank, but accepted a cash settlement, which he used to make improvements to the schoolhouse that the town's budget had been unable to cover. A second stove, new roof shingles, and a floor repair that Eudora had been documenting for the school board since October. He arranged it through the school board without attaching his name to the gift, and Eudora only learned the source when the school board treasurer let it slip with the expression of a man who had been holding a secret uncomfortably long. She confronted Albert about it directly and without preliminary, and he received the confrontation with the composed steadiness of a man who had expected it and was not going to apologize for the action, only explain it. The children needed a warm floor, he said. The settlement money was clean, it made sense. You could have told me, she said. I didn't want you to feel like it was, he stopped, chose his words. I didn't want you to feel like every resource I had was being organized around you in a way that reduced your independence. She stared at him. Albert, she said, with the particular tone she had developed for when he was being both right and wrong at the same time in a way that was uniquely frustrating. My independence is not reduced by you caring about the same things I care about. The children's warm floor is not a romantic gesture. It is just a correct use of available resources. I know that, he said. I overcomplicated it. You did, she agreed. Don't do it again. If you're going to be in my life, you have to let me know when you're involved in things that matter to me. I cannot be managed, even kindly. Understood, he said, and she could see that he meant it completely, which was one of the things about him that made everything else possible. He did not argue with a correct point. He absorbed it and changed. The second thing that happened in February was that two of the larger homesteading families in the valley, the Corsons and the Maidas, who had come out from Ohio and from Virginia respectively, lost significant portions of their winter stores to a barn fire that started in a faulty chimney joint. The community response was swift and genuine: food donations, labor for the rebuilding, temporary accommodation. But it was Albert who organized the practical reconstruction effort, coordinating materials and labor across both the cattlemen's and the homesteaders' communities with the same efficiency he brought to range management. Eudora watched him move between those two communities, which had not been on easy terms, and smooth the friction with competence and even-handedness, and she loved him more distinctly and specifically than she had yet managed. The third thing was that in the third week of February, Albert came to the boarding house on a Tuesday evening rather than a Sunday afternoon, and asked Mrs. Henderson if he could speak with Miss Brooks privately. And Mrs. Henderson, who was not actually capable of allowing a conversation to be entirely private under her own roof, arranged for them to use the parlor while she was in the kitchen at the entirely insufficient distance of 20 feet. Albert stood in the boarding house parlor with his hat in his hands and his composure in place and said, "Eudora, I would like to ask you to marry me. I want to ask you properly and directly and give you whatever time you need to consider it, because I am aware that this is the most significant decision a person makes, and it should be made without pressure. But I also want to be clear that I am asking because I am certain, and because I want to build a life with you specifically, and because I think we could do something worthwhile together in this valley, and I would very much like to find out if I'm right about that." Eudora looked at him standing in the boarding house parlor in the February lamplight with his hat in his hands. This steady, complicated, quietly extraordinary man who had paid her father's debt, and protected her from a threat she hadn't known existed, and saved her a seat at the autumn social, and cut firewood for her schoolhouse and organized barn raisings for homesteaders, and kissed her in December gold light, and argued with her fairly and changed when she pointed out he was wrong. And she thought about what it would mean to build a life alongside someone like that, in this valley with its difficult winters and its political complications, and its enormous sky and its complete, terrifying, magnificent possibilities. "Yes," she said. "My answer is yes, and I don't need time to consider it. I've been considering it since October without realizing that's what I was doing, and the conclusion was settled before you asked." Mrs. Henderson, from the kitchen, made a sound that was identifiable as a contained exclamation of joy, and they both pretended not to hear it, and Albert covered the distance between them in 3 steps and took her face in his hands with the gentleness of someone holding something irreplaceable, and she put her hands over his and felt the calluses from 20 years of ranch work, and thought that she had never touched anything more completely real. They were married in April, in the Dusty Creek Baptist Church, on a morning when the first real warmth of spring was coming in off the plains, and the cottonwoods along the creek were pushing out their new leaves. The whole of Dusty Creek came. The church held 60 seated and about 30 more standing at the back, and Reverend McAllister performed the service with genuine pleasure, and only a minimal quantity of the extended metaphors he tended toward. Margaret Garrison came from Abilene and cried with the controlled precision of a woman who had decided one bout of dignified tears was the appropriate allocation. Caleb and Ada Reeves sat in the second pew and looked quietly, deeply satisfied. The Corson family came, and the Maida family, and old Dr. Sheridan, and Martha Yates, who had been pivotal in the seating arrangement at the autumn social, and who accepted no responsibility whatsoever for any romantic developments while clearly being extremely proud of them. Eudora wore a dress the color of cream wool with her mother's lace collar, and carried wild sage from the creek bottom, because she had not wanted flowers from the general store when the living prairie was right there. And Albert stood at the front of the church in a dark coat that fit him as though he had been born to it, and watched her walk down the aisle with the expression of a man who had stopped trying to manage his own face in this particular moment, and was simply allowing what he felt to be entirely visible. And the 50-odd people in the pews saw it, and collectively held a breath. She reached him at the front of the church, and he took her hand, and the warmth of it traveled straight to the center of her chest, and settled there like it had always been meant to be there. "We are gathered," said Reverend McAllister, in the voice he saved for significant occasions, "to witness the joining of 2 people who have demonstrated, in the manner in which they have arrived at this moment, that careful and deliberate intention is not the enemy of feeling, but its most faithful companion." Eudora looked at Albert and he looked at her, and the words were true. Their life together began in the ranch house, which Albert had spent the weeks before the wedding making ready in ways that were both practical and quietly thoughtful, a proper desk for her work in the front room, shelves for her books along the parlor wall, a garden space marked out behind the house in a spot with the best sun. She brought her 2 trunks and her carpetbag and her box of books and filled the house with herself, and the house received it as though it had always been waiting. She continued teaching. The school board had been prepared for her resignation upon marriage, which was common practice, but she had made it clear in February that she intended to continue, and Albert had made it clear that he supported this entirely, and between the 2 of them they had presented the board with such a composed and united position that the board had agreed without significant argument. Several of Dusty Creek's older women had opinions about a married woman keeping a position, but Eudora had found, over her years of dealing with other people's opinions about the choices she made, that a clear and cheerful disregard for uninstructed opinions was an invaluable social tool. The spring of 1884 was a good one by the valley's standards: adequate rain, moderate temperatures, no significant conflict between the homesteaders and the cattlemen, in part because Albert's cooperative water rights proposal had been adopted by the valley's informal association of landowners after a winter of careful groundwork. The crops went in on schedule, the cattle gained weight on the spring grass, and Dusty Creek had the cautiously optimistic mood of a community that had survived its difficult period and was beginning to believe in something more stable. In June, Eudora knew she was carrying their first child. She told Albert on a Sunday evening after supper, sitting on the porch with the long summer light going gold across the valley, and he was still for a full moment, and then turned to her with the undefended face she loved most and said, "Are you well? First, before anything else, were you well?" She said she was very well, and he said, "Good," and put his arm around her, and she leaned into his shoulder, and they sat with the summer evening and the knowledge of what was coming, and she had never felt so completely unhurried in her life. Their son was born in February of 1885, on a Sunday morning when the snow was coming down in large, slow flakes, and the house was warm, and Ada Reeves was present along with Dr. Sheridan, and Albert was present too, which Dr. Sheridan considered unusual, and Albert considered entirely non-negotiable. The baby was healthy, demanding, and in Eudora's completely unbiased assessment, the most interesting person she had ever encountered at this level of acquaintance. They named him Thomas Clement Garrison, Thomas for Albert's father, Clement for hers. Albert held his son for the first time with the hands that were capable of managing 15,000 head of cattle and repairing fences in blizzard conditions, and he held the boy as though he was the most significant thing those hands had ever been trusted with, which Eudora thought was probably accurate. "Hello, Thomas," he said quietly. "We've been expecting you." The boy looked up at him with the unfocused gravity of the newborn, and Albert looked down at him with the focused gravity of a man, comprehending something new about the nature of the world. And Eudora watched the two of them from the bed with the aftermath of labor in her bones and the specific warmth of a joy she had not known existed before this, and thought that the distance between February of 1883, when she had stepped off a train in Kansas with a debt and a broken heart, and February of 1885, when she was lying in a warm room watching her husband meet their son, was measurable in years, but not really, because the real distance was incalculable, and the real journey had been something other than geographical. Thomas grew with the vigorous determinism of a child who had inherited his father's physical constitution and his mother's verbal tendencies, and the combination produced a boy who was large for his age and entirely willing to tell you about it. He followed Albert around the ranch from the time he could walk with any stability, and Albert bore this with the patient pleasure of a man who had decided that having his work interrupted by his son's questions was not interruption but enrichment. Caleb Reeves, who had no children of his own, attached to the boy with the straightforward depth of feeling that often exists between people in that circumstance, and Thomas called him Uncle Caleb and Ada Aunt Ada, and the ranch house became, with gradual organic certainty, a place that was large enough for all of them. Eudora continued teaching through Thomas's early years, returning to the school after each of what would eventually be 3 maternity leaves, and the school grew with her teaching it. More students as more families arrived in the valley, more grades properly separated, a second teacher hired by 1887 to handle the lower grades, while Eudora focused on the older students. She had lobbied the school board for this expansion with the relentlessness of someone who believed that the quality of what children were taught was the single most important determinant of what the valley would eventually become, and Albert had supported her campaign with the school board through his own influence and connections, and the combination had been effective. In 1887, their second child arrived, another son, whom they named James, after Albert's maternal grandfather. Where Thomas was large and talkative, James was compact and watchful, with his father's quality of observing deeply before committing to speech, and Eudora recognized the pattern and felt the particular affection of familiarity for it. Thomas adored his brother with the loud, physical affection of older brothers everywhere, which James received with the measured patience of someone who had arrived already knowing his own mind. The valley changed around them through the late 1880s, as valleys do more wire, more homestead farms, more people arriving with their particular needs and ambitions and grievances. The gradual complicated transition from open range to mixed use that Albert had seen coming and had worked to make less painful than it might have been. There were still conflicts, still moments of sharp disagreement between the various factions that made up the valley's population, still the underlying tensions of race and class, an origin that no amount of cooperative water rights could entirely dissolve. But Albert continued the work of what he called paying attention, and Eudora continued the work of the school, and together they occupied a particular position in the community's life that had something to do with being trusted by multiple sides of most arguments, which was neither comfortable nor unrewarding. In 1889, Eudora sat on the porch of the ranch house one October evening, 6 years after she had stepped off the train in Dusty Creek with her 2 trunks and her debt and her carpet bag, and looked at what her life had become. Thomas was 4, large and energetic, and currently chasing the barn cats around the yard with the focused optimism of someone who had never yet caught one. James was 2, sitting in Albert's lap with complete composure, being shown the constellations that were coming out in the eastern sky with the quiet tutorial patience that Albert brought to everything he considered worth knowing. The ranch house had its lights on in the gathering dark. The valley below was settling into its autumn quiet. Somewhere along the creek, a night bird was making its single repeated statement into the cooling air. Albert looked up from James to find her watching him, and she saw the same thing she always saw in that face: the attention, the steadiness, the undefended love that he had long since stopped managing and simply allowed to be completely visible to her, which was the gift she valued most of all the significant gifts he had given her. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking," she said, "about the autumn social in 1883. He smiled the slow, full smile. "The chair," she confirmed. "I have spent considerable time being grateful that you were the kind of man to reserve a chair quietly rather than simply asking. You wouldn't have sat in it if I'd asked," he pointed out. "I absolutely would not have," she agreed. "I was in a terrible state of self-protection." "You were doing what made sense at the time," he said. "I was doing what made sense at the time. It worked out." She looked at him across the porch with their 4-year-old running in circles in the yard and their 2-year-old reaching up to point at a star and said, "Albert Garrison, it worked out magnificently." He held her gaze with everything he was, all of it visible, none of it managed, and said, "It did." The night came down over the valley, and the stars came out in full. The enormous Kansas sky that she had learned to love as she had learned to love everything here, slowly, completely, and with the knowledge that what was earned by attention and endurance was kept more surely than what was simply given. Thomas eventually gave up on the barn cats and came to sit on the porch steps with the magnificent unconcern of the exhausted child. James fell asleep against his father's chest, his small hand still pointed at the sky where a star had been. Inside the ranch house, her books were on the shelves she and Albert had built together in the first winter of their marriage. Her father's name was on the dedication of the small reading primer she had written for her younger students, the first publication she had managed with the help of a Wichita press that had taken an interest. The eastern quarter section of the Garrison Ranch had been replanted and was growing again. The land returned to productive use in the way that land always returns when it is worked with care. Caleb and Ada were in their own house a quarter-mile along the road, a house that had been built on a portion of the Garrison land that Albert had made over to Caleb in 1886 in recognition of 18 years of loyalty that he described as being worth considerably more than a quarter section of grassland. Horace Finch remained in Wichita and did not return to the valley, which was the best possible outcome of that particular chapter. The First Territorial Bank had a new branch manager, a man named Patterson who conducted his affairs with straightforward transparency and had not once attempted to use anyone's debt as a personal lever, which Eudora considered the baseline minimum requirement for the position, and Albert considered an improvement worthy of acknowledgement. The valley was not perfect. The tensions between large and small operations persisted in the way that economic structural tensions always persist, because they are not fundamentally about the people involved, but about the systems they are living inside. There were bad winters and dry summers, and the occasional range fire that required everyone to drop their grievances and work together. And there were political fights about water and fence lines and grazing rights that went on for years. There was the broad and terrible question of what was happening to the indigenous peoples of the region, which Albert spoke of with a directness that his peers found uncomfortable, but which Eudora believed was the minimum honesty required of people who lived on land that had been taken, and which she made sure her students understood as part of the history they were living inside rather than a footnote to it. But within that imperfect and complicated world, the life they had built was solid and real and deeply, thoroughly good. Thomas grew into a boy who combined his mother's love of words with his father's love of the land in a way that produced a person who could tell you precisely what the spring grass was doing, and also why it mattered in language that you would want to hear again. James grew into a boy who could fix any mechanical thing the ranch produced, and who asked questions that arrived at the center of things without announcing they were coming. And in 1890, a daughter arrived, whom they named Margaret Ann Garrison, after her grandmother, who came from Abilene and held her granddaughter with the controlled precision of a woman allocating her tears carefully, and who looked at Eudora across the room with the expression of someone who had been right about something important and was content to let that be its own acknowledgement. On a cold January morning in 1891, Eudora stood in the schoolhouse with its 2 stoves, and its repaired floor and its full complement of students and its second teacher working in the adjacent room, and she thought about the February morning 8 years ago when she had arrived in Dusty Creek with 2 trunks and a debt and a letter from the Board of Education, and the specific, driving determination of someone who has no option but to make things work. She thought about what she had known then and what she knew now. She thought about the distance between those 2 states of knowledge and what it had taken to travel it, the fear and the grief and the careful rebuilding and the autumn social and the empty chair, and the man who had saved it for her with the quiet, certain confidence of someone who knew what he wanted and was willing to wait for the right moment to offer it. She loved Albert Garrison with the comprehensive, fully informed, daily renewed love of someone who knew exactly who he was and chose him completely and specifically, and without reservation. She loved the ranch and the valley and the difficult, beautiful plains that had been both harder and more rewarding than anything she had imagined when she stepped off the train. She loved her sons and her daughter and the particular, unrepeatable life that had been built from the wreckage of her father's debts and a predatory banker's miscalculation, and a cattleman's quiet, steady, unannounced devotion. She was, she thought, exactly where she was supposed to be. She had been, since a certain October evening in 1883, in the process of arriving here. And she was grateful, with the deepest and most specific gratitude she knew how to feel, for every step of the journey that had brought her to it, including and especially the step that had carried her across the crowded floor of Caldwell's General Hall toward a chair that had been quietly waiting for her at the end of a long table, beside a man who had set it there because he believed, with the full weight of his steady and extraordinary conviction, that she would come. She had come. She had stayed. She had built something magnificent, and she intended to keep building it for the rest of her life. Outside the schoolhouse window, the Kansas morning was coming on in its January way, hard and clear and cold and luminous, the sky the color of good intentions, the snow on the ground catching the light and giving it back redoubled. The cottonwoods along the creek stood in their winter patience, waiting for what would come. In the spring, they would open again into that corridor of gold and green that she had walked through with Albert in their early weeks, when everything was still uncertain, and the possibility of all of it was just beginning to unfold. The creek would run clear and fast with the snowmelt, and the cattle would move to the spring pastures, and the valley would go about its difficult and beautiful business of being exactly what it was, and she would be here in the middle of it, fully present, fully committed, fully and completely home. She turned back to her students who were waiting with the particular contained energy of children who had been patient for as long as they intended to be, and she smiled at them and said, "All right, then. Let us begin." And they began.